In 1999, two genre filmmakers, both known for making successful horror franchise sequels in the 80s, made their own big-budget creature features. Renny Harlin, who burst onto the scene in the late 80s when he directed A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, who then achieved huge success with his action feature Cliffhanger in 1993, created a $60 million action-packed shark movie with a stacked cast and plenty of monster movie carnage. Meanwhile, Friday the 13th Parts 2 and 3 director Steve Miner created a $30 million killer crocodile movie. With a script by David E. Kelly, the film blended quirky comedy with creature feature horror. Both movies achieved huge success and both rounded off a decade that's now become known for its big-budget glossy monster movies, the likes of which no longer exist. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss Renny Harlin's Deep Blue Sea and Steve Miner's Lake Placid.
You think water's fast? You should see ice.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 24. This is one that I know a lot of you have been waiting for a while. This week, we're discussing two beloved creature features from 1999, Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid. They will both be spoilerific discussions, so please do give them both a watch. They're so much fun before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss this week's films, a very good friend of mine, a longtime friend of the pod. He was here last year during our home invasion season to discuss Your Next and The Guest with me, and he's back. A big welcome to writer, actor, podcaster, just all-round legend, Joshua Tonks. Hello, Joshua.
Hello, Mike. How are you?
I'm so good, thank you. It's such a joy to have you back on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm feeling festive. I'm enjoying the chill in the air. I've been very grateful for the weather, but that's boring. Why do we want to talk about weather?
I agree, though. It feels wintry at last, and also
does.
Do you get festive early? Like, are you one of those people that could pop on some Mariah from November 1st?
Oh, I mean, I could pop on some Mariah from July, but yes, I do actually. I'm fine with it. I'm like, why not? What's the problem?
Yeah.
But also not a problem if you don't as well. Like,
Yeah, live your life. Live your life how you want to live it, you know?
Live the dream.
So let me ask you, Josh, about, like, last year we talked about Home Invasion, which I know you were a big fan of.
We did.
What are your thoughts on this subgenre, the kind of nature, animal attack movies, creature features, that kind of thing?
I was thinking about this and kind of laughing because I remember listening to the Home Invasion series and everyone being like, it's the scariest one. I can't handle it. It's too much. And me being like, I love these. These are great. Yeah. These are my favorite. And then the absolute opposite is for these. It's like, so all animals scare me, big and small. It doesn't matter. So
really?
I find like animal attack movies quite scary. Mm-hmm. It's just I'm just basically trying not to say that I don't like animals because that makes me sound like I'm an awful person.
Yeah, you can't say that you do. What, even dogs? Do you not like dogs?
I mean, I love dogs. Dogs are probably the fave, but I'm still there's basically with every single animal on the planet, there's 10% of me constantly that's scared.
Yeah,
regardless.
Fair enough.
So, you know, that's my vibe going into these movies.
Yeah, I think that's sensible, though. I think you know, the vibe of these movies and the theme is generally like, maybe we should just leave animals alone, right? Let
leave
them be. They've got their lives, they've got their world, we've got ours, you know?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I can't handle as well, and, you know, social media is a pit of despair and misery anyway, but when I end up scrolling, and I tend to linger on some of the more animal-focused ones, and I think it's because I don't want to look at them, but I can't look away. And the amount of things where it's like this heartwarming clip of someone rescuing something from something that, like, humans made anyway. It's like, we're the problem.
Yeah.
So it's not really that heroic that you're saving a penguin from whatever you caused in the first place. But
Yeah.
anyway.
I know, it's so true, like an oil drum or something. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, well, that's just really bleak on so many levels. Yeah.
I saw this thing about puffins where they were like, we're throwing these puffins out to sea. How amazing, because they get confused because of all the city lights.
No.
So they're supposed to go to the sea by the moon or whatever. I don't know. But yeah.
The sea by the moon.
This is so stupid. Sea by the moon. Whatever.
Yeah. Do you have any particular big phobias? Like, do you freak out if you get a spider in the house? Anything like that?
So as a kid, I was obsessed with sharks. That was the one.
Ooh,
Sharks.
okay.
So they're the ones, anything under the water, that's the worst. That's the scariest. So these two films are perfect.
Did that come from seeing, like, Jaws, for example, as a kid? Like, is that what
100%. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was Jaws. And I don't know, just, it's funny, like, I don't know, remember being a kid and, I feel like we all have those like random obsessions. Like I remember going through a phase where I was like obsessed with Egypt.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's like you learn something at school and then you become really obsessed with it. I think sharks were one of those things. And I remember I had like a shark documentary on VHS and they'd really sold it on the back as like it was going to be like this really cool, scary documentary, but it was actually really boring. But it was because they were just off the back of the hype of Jaws and all of that.
Yeah, no, I think we all seem to have that kind of like absolute fascination with sharks, don't we? Like above all other kind of big scary animals. I don't know what it is. It's I like, people have talked about it already this series, that there's almost something primal in our brains that is like, no, when we see a shark, you know, like,
Yes.
and I'm totally with you. Like, why would somebody go swimming in the ocean when they don't know what's
At
down
all.
there, you know? Just
Like-
give me a pool. I'll be fine in a pool,
Yeah,
you know?
give me a paddling pool in the back garden. I'm fine. Sunny day. That's all I need.
So we're talking about two movies from 1999. Let's just talk briefly before we get into these films, like where horror sort of was at this time, because it's been really interesting, and we've talked before, Josh, about like kind of the teen slasher movement at this time and that kind of thing, but there's been this other kind of boom at this time too of these sort of creature features, right? Like I discussed last week with Joe and Trace, movies like Deep Rising and Anaconda. There was a real kind of wave of them, wasn't there, at this time, weirdly? A kind of return to the kind of 70s animal attack movies almost.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of similar in music. It's just that sort of cultural cycle that we go through. We're sort of in that 20 to 25 year period where whatever was happening the sort of 2 decades before sort of comes back in vogue. And, you know, there's nothing more 90s than the 70s. And you know, it was where we were getting our bootcut jeans were coming back in, and you know that sort of like Steps were doing their riff on ABBA, and so we're sort of seeing that again in the 90s with these sort of disaster epics and these animal attack movies. And I think probably the advancements in technology helps as well. I feel like there was probably a lot of directors that were very excited at the prospect of being able to recreate the types of movies they loved when they were kids, but now with all this new technology that they could use.
Yes, totally. I wonder how important Jurassic Park in 1993 was, right? To that,
Huge.
everything that came afterwards, all those monster movies, creature features, CGI, all of that kind of thing. I think you're right. Everything.
Yeah, it's Jurassic Park is like all over both these movies, and you can almost see. Like, I always think about Godzilla as well in 1998. It's like they have to have the raptor section with, like, the smaller baby Godzillas. You know, they have to do that. You can see a lot of that. And Jaws as well. I think Spielberg is probably, like, he's the one when it comes to these types of movies, for sure.
Absolutely. It's really hard not to compare, especially a movie like this, to Jaws, right? And I think that was a concern they had. You know, when they were developing it, Rennie Harlin was like, how do we make this its own thing that isn't Jaws, that isn't going to get compared to Jaws? So we'll talk about that as we go. So let's get into it. Let's begin with Deep Blue Sea from 1999, directed by Rennie Harlin, written by Duncan Kennedy and a couple of other people. Josh, just set the scene for us. What is Deep Blue Sea all about?
Yeah, so on a giant floating underwater lab, a group of scientists meddle with nature and pay the ultimate price. After the mako sharks, they've genetically genetically modified in an attempt to cure Alzheimer's, escape and begin picking them off one by one.
Oh, lovely. What a movie. Josh, what's your kind of history with this? Do you remember kind of when you first came to this film? Was it when you were little Josh that was obsessed with sharks?
Oh, yeah, it was. I loved this movie. I was obsessed with this movie. I had it on repeat. I would invite friends over to watch it and then scare them at particular moments because I knew where the jump scares were coming. I adored this movie. I had so much fun with it. It would be one of those movies similar to Jurassic Park, actually, where there were certain sections that I would just rewatch over and over again. So if I was doing a rewatch of the movie, I'd kind of skip through all the talking at the beginning and maybe just cut to LL Cool J in the oven, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I remember it very clearly as well. Like, rented this on video it was probably about a year after it came out, right? Probably around 2000. Absolutely loved it. And everyone seemed to love this movie, right? Like, I don't think I've really spoken to anyone, particularly of our generation or even older than us, that don't kind of think of this film quite fondly in a way, right? And it, oh my God, it grossed like $160 million as well. So it was like a massive, massive hit.
I was going to say, you can see the thumbprints of Scream all over it as well, because it does sort of follow that slasher trajectory. It's just you're exchanging a robed masked killer for sharks. And so you do have that sort of like zippy, witty group of characters that get killed off one by one, but just in a different format. So I think it is very much of its time. So that I think the comparisons to Jaws are quite funny, actually, because I don't really see many. I think it's very, very different.
Totally. I other than the fact that obviously it's about sharks, I wouldn't say it really has any similarities to Jaws whatsoever. No. You're absolutely right. It feels more akin to 90s horror, like everything from the soundtrack to the jokes, the dialogue, the opening scene with the people on the boat getting attacked and everything. Yeah. Like I suppose you get that in Jaws as well, but like it feels much more like a glossy 90s movie. And I think also this was made for a budget of sort of between $60 and $80 million, right? And again, this is something that feels very of its time, right? That you get a kind of medium to large budget movie like this, like a B movie, essentially, right? Getting a theatrical release as well, right?
That was something I thought was really funny when I was watching both these movies, which was like, on the one hand, I miss that we get these sort of popcorn blockbusters that aren't really about anything. They're not really saying anything, even though maybe Deep Blue Sea a little bit is trying to possibly, but is it really? Is it just trying to facilitate a load of scares? And I miss that we have, being 60 to 80 million dollar budgets being thrown at these types of movies. And then on the other hand, I was like, and we'll get to this later, but like, do we really need to be dangling a cow? Like, what are we doing?
Yes.
Like, it's very like we're still in that era of excess. We haven't had the stock market crash. We haven't had 9/11. We're still in a very hopeful time, but we're also in a time of complete and utter excess.
Yes.
And this feels like we're at the very tail end of that maybe started in the 80s. And everything's just big and loud and just stupid, but really entertaining.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, it's almost like, and 1999 is so often considered the greatest ever year in cinema in general, right? Probably not because of Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid, but you never know. But
you don't know.
I do think there is something about that argument that the cinema industry was really at its peak at this time, right? Like, I think, like, just in terms of how much money it was making and what it could make, and
for sure
how much like people lapped up this kind of stuff. It is amazing. Like, I just think this would never in a million years get made now, I think, right? Like this.
No,
like,
I mean, these movies felt like events.
Yeah,
they?
Yeah, exactly. We've had a couple of shark movies this year. Like, there's that Under Paris one and stuff, right? And like, they usually just kind of get like spat out on Netflix or whatever, don't they? And they're probably much, much smaller budget. They probably don't have, like Samuel L. Jackson and people like in this movie as well, right? It's just crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. There isn't that sort of, I mean, it was starting to dissipate in the 90s, but there was still a monoculture. things weren't fractured across multiple streaming services or YouTube or the internet or TikTok or whatever. Like, there were still these, like, this one place where you would go and watch something, but because of the money and the success, there was, like, more of it. So if you didn't want to watch X movie, you could go watch Y movie, but it would all be in the cinema. And things would come out then on VHS and then DVD. Like, it wouldn't be that long that you had to wait. You still had to wait, but, like, within a year, you could own it and watch it again and again and again. And I think that's just not what we do anymore. There's just so much choice that you can't even decide what to watch.
Well, there was even, I remember, because I obviously being of a younger age, I remember it almost being an event too when they came out on video, right? Because that was often when I could see these things. And do you remember, like, even in a Blockbuster, it would be like a new release like Deep Blue Sea. It probably would have had a whole shelf, like, just with like 24 copies of the one film, right? Because so it would literally dominate a space in the shop when a new movie like this would drop, you know?
Yeah, and there'd be commercials for it on television. You'd have adverts for the video coming out. Remember that with Titanic and everything. And then if anything got a re-release as well, it would be huge.
Yeah, Trace was saying last week about how he remembers so clearly, not just like the film, but the VHS he owned of it, and he would remember the trailers beforehand in order, off by heart, and that kind of thing, right? Which, so true.
That's very Trace.
Yeah. Very evocative of this era, though, isn't it? Yeah, it really is.
Yes.
Oh,
absolutely.
God. So Rennie Harlin obviously directed this movie. He's had a few highs and lows. You know, we watched together this year, Josh, The Strangers, Chapter 1.
Oh, gosh, yes. Couldn't be more different, could it, really?
I know.
But it just, you know what, actually, we laugh, but that's a really, really good point. Even the biggest, you know, Rennie Harlin is known for, you know, his excess, you know, Nightmare 4, Cliffhanger, am I right with that?
Cliffhanger, that was his big hit.
Yeah. These big visually, you know, bombastic movies, and we don't make those types of movies as much anymore. And these directors that were known for that have to really recalibrate and sort of reestablish how they fit. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I think, you know, you've spoken about, you know, M. Night Shyamalan's movies before, and how, you know, he was at the peak of these like big, almost blockbuster event movies, and then had to rebrand himself as almost this like indie filmmaker. And it's sort of what Rennie Harlin sort of had to do. But here with Deep Blue Sea, we're like bang smack in the middle of him, sort of at the height of his powers almost.
Absolutely. I think it really is him at the height of his powers, because, you know, he had to go with Elm Street 4, which is a really fun film, right? But obviously it's not really considered one of the greats in terms of that franchise, I think. But it has its moments. And actually, when I interviewed Rennie Harlin earlier this year, and we talked about Elm Street 4, and he was saying it was kind of his idea to come up with all of those wacky, mad visuals, like putting victims on a pizza and all of that stuff that you get that kind of ended up being responsible for the kind of comic bookification of Freddy Krueger in a way. Like, I think Rennie Harlin was kind of responsible for that, but he's really good at visuals. I think he's really good at big set pieces. Obviously, Cliffhanger, he's really good at action, and I guess he gets to do a bit of all of that, doesn't he? You get all of what he's good at here, because he's giving us kind of monster movie horror, but this is also very much an action movie, isn't it? In a way, it's kind of action horror.
Yeah, for sure. I really think what Deep Blue Sea excels at is sort of, and again, this is a very 90s thing, but that meld of genres. You know, you've got the action movie, you've got the disaster movie, because you've actually got the building coming around, you know, the Poseidon adventure of it all. And then you've obviously got the sharks in the water, and there's some genuine horror in this. You know, some of the kills and some of the things, I think I messaged you and said that, like, the moment where Stellan Skarsgård's character gets dropped in the middle of a storm, he's armless and he's dropped on a gurney into the water. He's like
strapped to a gurney,
hellish. And he's got the oxygen tank on so he can still breathe. That is my idea That's like my worst nightmare.
Yes.
But it's also ridiculous as well.
Absolutely. It really rides the line. And this is a really hard thing to get right. And we've talked about this a lot, especially throughout this subgenre, kind of balancing comedy with horror, right? Because a lot of these movies don't take themselves too seriously. And it's really difficult to lean too far into one or the other, right? But how do you find Rennie Harlin kind of balances the tones of this, that quippy 90s-ness, I suppose, right? With the genuine horror and action.
Yeah, it was funny watching it this time because I was very entertained, and so much of it is so corny. You know, Samuel L. Jackson making speeches about, you know, surviving in the Alps or the Himalayas or wherever it was.
Yeah.
And just the way Thomas Jane, you know, they sort of have that like dick swinging moment where they're talking to each other and sort of... And Thomas Jane's using a load of like underwater metaphors where he's like can't talk to me like that, won't float with me.
Yeah,
you know,
I'm here to make waves.
Yeah, I'm not here to make waves. All of that shit. It's like, oh my goodness. So it's this really corny dialogue that I think, but it's also like kind of cool as well. But then it's really mean. It's really mean-spirited in the way that it dispatches its characters. It's somewhat merciless, but does it with glee. It really enjoys killing all the people in this movie.
Yes, and actually that is something in stark contrast to Lake Placid, which we'll talk about, right? I think I really loved this film's meanness for sure, and you can kind of take a bit of a guess at the beginning who's going to end up surviving, but I think there are a couple of surprises potentially, right?
Yes.
What do you think of this like incredible stacked cast then? You know, you've mentioned Thomas Jane as our kind of hero, our sort of shark hunter, right? Our grizzled hero. And then you've got, you know, LL Cool J and Stellan Skarsgård, Samuel L. Jackson, Saffron Burrows. Like, what do you think of this stacked cast?
I think it's great. I mean, it's very, very telling of the era. Again, we don't quite get that as much anymore. These actors, if they're ever in genre now, it ends up on TV, like a limited series, a streaming series. We don't get them in these movies that much. So it was actually nice to have big stars in genre. I love that LL Cool J follows up his his role as a sort of like wisecracking side character in Halloween H2O.
Yeah. And then Steve
Miner kind of sort of plays, exactly. Plays almost an identical role, or at least fulfills the same purpose within Deep Blue Sea as well. And that was a big thing of this time as well, which was having rappers in these types of movies, which are so historically white, to sort of have these sort of black celebrity characters. You've got Usher in The Faculty. You've got Busta Rhymes in Halloween Resurrection.
Yes.
Obviously LL in both of these movies, you know, H2O and Deep Blue Sea.
Last week we talked about Ice Cube in Anaconda as well.
Yes, exactly. J-Lo. Like you have these characters because they sort of like bridge the demographics and bring everyone in, and also they get the opportunity to plug a single as well.
I know. Yeah. Oh, as well, that's the thing. Like, I mean, this probably still exists now, but you get a movie like this come out, you get the accompanying single and music video that goes with it as well, right? That was very much a thing. Yeah.
So of the time. But yes, I enjoy the cast. I love that Samuel L. can't say words. I love that Samuel L. Jackson is actually kind of a bit of a B-movie star, isn't he, really?
Yeah.
And I love the way that he's dispatched. I think it's hilarious, and I remember it scaring the shit out of me the first time that I watched it, to the point where, like I said earlier, I vividly remember inviting a friend round and waiting for that moment and jumping out at the same time that happened, and he lost his shit, like just fell on the floor. It was the best.
It's so good. That's the moment that I remembered above everything else, really. I remembered two moments in this film, because I literally, this was the first time I saw it since probably about the year 2000, and I remembered...
Was the second moment Saffron Burrows getting her kit off, you horny little
Do you know what? Actually, it was as well. There were three moments then. There were three moments, because I remember that so clearly as well, her taking off the rubber, the insulating kind of suit, right? Hilarious. And then I remembered Samuel L. Jackson getting chomped, and I remember LL Cool J getting trapped in his own oven by the shark. Like, that's another thing that I very clearly remembered. It does have those kind of key set pieces in this movie.
It does.
How do you find, just like, again, there's a lot of money went into this, like can you see all that money on the screen, like in terms of the set design, the general kind of look and world building, I guess, of this movie?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, I love anything in the movie that's shot on the surface.
Yeah.
Sort of the beginning and the end, and you've got that sort of like Tom Cruise, Top Gun, you know,
yeah.
Everything's shot in like, everything seems to be at sunset or sunrise constantly. And so everything looks sun-kissed and beautiful. And then all the sort of the technological aspects and the actual practical sharks, I think, look fantastic. Obviously the CGI looks terrible. It looks like a bad video game.
Yes.
But there isn't actually as much of that as I remember. Like, there's a few wide shots where you're like, ugh, and the moments where characters do get chomped and eaten look bad.
Yes.
But I can look back on that quite fondly. So yes, there's it's funny. There's far less egregious CGI than there is Christian messaging that's like forced down our throats. This movie,
yeah, that is true. There's a lot of like clutching of a crucifix and stuff, isn't there, in this movie? Yeah, it's so true. I wonder if the other movie that really looms large as well over these films is James Cameron's Titanic as well,
sure.
right? Obviously, like, you know, we talked about how it mirrors the 70s, and in the 70s you had those giant like natural disaster movies, or you had Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, those sorts of things, very starry and very high budget. And then obviously this decade we had like Twister, and then of course we had Titanic, which in some ways the ultimate kind of nature biting back movie, I guess, in a way, Titanic. And that was part of the reason, I think, why we talked about this last week with Deep Rising, this big horror movie set on a boat, a cruise ship. It came out at the same time as Titanic. Like, Titanic was still in movie theaters when Deep Rising came out, and I think no one really wanted to go see this other much cheaper boat movie, you know?
Right.
But I think this movie maybe is the opposite. It comes out a year later. We've had a bit of time, but I maybe there is still that trend for let's do some big aquatic adventure movie, you know? Because it's very much got that vibe as well, I think.
Agreed. And so many of the scenes where, you know, Saffron Burrows or LL Cool J is like walking through the sort of waist deep water, that just reminds me of Jack and Rose sort of trying to escape the sort of level 2 of the Titanic or whatever. It reminds me a lot of that. And what I find really interesting is, I think, you know, you'll know this for sure, but like, there are those movies that you watch, like your movie firsts that you watch.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, Jaws, Scream, Titanic, they're kind of those movies for me. And because of that, they're so influential that you're almost chasing that high. And so if there's a movie that recreates even the slightest moment of that, you're going to love it, because it's sort of recapturing the magic of that feeling that you got when you were a kid and you first saw it. I was obsessed with Titanic. I would watch that on VHS like every Sunday. And I remember, and I did it. This is, okay, I'm going to be so nerdy right now. I used to, when they go under the water and Jack's like, Rose, you've got to hold your breath. The ship is going to suck us down. I used to hold my breath and see if I could stay under as long.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens at the end of Deep Blue Sea. And I tell you this, I sat in my bedroom watching Deep Blue Sea last night and held my breath to see if I could hold it as long as they do from when they swim up however many feet from the bottom.
Oh, I love that.
And I did it.
Did you manage it? Yeah, good work.
Yeah. Only just, though. Only just. And I was sitting very still. Like, I couldn't imagine doing that with the stress and the panic. Like, this is one of the things I think that's so good about the movie as well, is like, the stakes feel so high. And I couldn't imagine so many situations I watch and go, oh, could I survive that? Would I be able to get out of that situation? And with Deep Blue Sea, I was, you know, could I hold my breath that long, but also swim, but also not be scared of the sharks, you know, around me as well? And then what do I do when I get to the surface? Like, there's that level of sort of panic that I think it captures really well.
Oh my God, absolutely. So much so. I will talk about the horror in a minute, actually, because I think it is so effective in that way. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, visually, I think this movie works so well. There are dodgy CGI shots, as you mentioned, but I agree with you. There are much less of them than I sort of remembered, or that I was kind of anticipating. I said the exact same thing about Anaconda last week, actually, because I remember Anaconda being like the bad CGI snake movie. And actually, the shots, the they are bad, but they're very, very brief, actually, most of the time.
Yes.
And then it switches to something practical, and then it really works. And I think it's the same with this. The film was shot in Fox Studios in Mexico, and basically everything is there. Everything is physical. They shot in these giant water tanks that actually apparently had been used for Titanic, so they were being reused for this movie.
Right.
And I think, again, that weirdly and quite depressingly feels quite unusual these days too, doesn't it? For a B movie like this, that they were filming in giant water tanks, that they had constructed this massive actual set and everything, and you really feel that when you watch it. You
do. It's so sad that we don't do that anymore. We just watched as part of EOH Live, you screened in Nightmare on Elm Street, and even with a sort of tiny budget that film was on, they still had these practical sets, the rotating rooms and all the blood and all of that kind of stuff, that the spandex used for Freddy to come through, all these practical elements that actually aren't that costly, really.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that we just do everything with CGI now and just rattle it out,
Yeah, it is. It's and I think the same goes for the shark, right? How do you, again, classically, this is a thing that we talked about so much throughout this whole subgenre, is how do you make these animals look good and scary? It's something that even Jaws, has famously struggled with, right? How do you find, the look of the shark? Maybe aside from those CGI shots, they used a lot of, animatronics and stuff, right? How do you find the way the sharks look in this?
I love them. them. I think they look really good. And it's nice that they're not a great white. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like those... That's sort of somewhat overdone, and so it's a different shape, and they've got this really sort of pointy snout almost. And I love the way that their skin looks when it's wet, that sort of really deep grey kind of colour. I think they look fab, and the teeth are really scary, the way they sort of slide out their jaws and all of that. Yeah, I think they're great.
So good. I agree. They look really fucking like monsters, like actual monsters at times in this, in a really fun way. I love this. This is so petty but brilliant. Apparently the shark used in Jaws was 25 foot long, so Rennie Harlin insisted that they increased the size of their animatronic shark to 26 feet to make it that much bigger than Jaws, so apparently. So they had a 26-foot animatronic shark. They also had scenes that they shot in the Bahamas with real sharks, and there was some stuff that Thomas Jane had to do where he was underwater in a cage with real sharks around him, and there was shark wranglers and everything. So again, that idea of I think when these things are pulled off best, it's when there are lots of different techniques used all in conjunction with each other. It's never just an animatronic.
Yes.
It's never just a CGI. He's kind of cleverly edited it where we get different types of sharks on screen,
Yeah, it's the Jurassic Park way, isn't it? Of mixing all the things. And I think that is when it works best. I actually do love the shots when you can tell it's a real shark. I find that really scary when they're peppered in as well.
Yeah.
Really good.
Hello everyone, just interrupting this week's episode momentarily to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Adam Wybray. Adam's a longtime friend of the pod. In fact, he joined me on a Patreon episode a few months ago to discuss Czech horror, which was fascinating. Adam really knows his stuff. And he has his own podcast called Still Scared. Still Scared is a podcast on children's horror that's recently celebrated its 7th anniversary. Adam started it with Ren Wednesday after hearing the second season of The Evolution of Horror on ghosts, with Ren knowing they shared a fondness for Goosebumps and other examples of spooky books, TV and films, especially those from the 1970s to the 90s. So far, they've covered The Demon Headmaster, Watership Down, Round the Twist, as well as children's authors such as Robert Swindles, Diana Wynne Jones, Vivian Alcock and Anne Fine. The podcast, Still Scared, is available on Apple Podcasts, Audible and Podigy. Is it Podigy? Podigy? I have no idea. If you like queer, awkward podcasts that reference old Stuart Lee and Richard Herring jokes, you'll probably enjoy it. A huge thank you to the brilliant Adam Wybray for sponsoring this week's episode, and I would massively recommend Still Scared podcast to all of you out there. I know so many of you have got a fondness for kids' horror. In fact, I've been sort of brainstorming what to do for the next season of the podcast, for season 11, and I was asking patrons and people on social media what sort of subgenre you'd like to hear covered, and so many of you asked about kids horror. I don't know if I'll ever do an entire season on kids horror personally, but if you want your kids horror fix, check out Adam's podcast, Still Scared, wherever you get your podcasts. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 Patreon subscriber, Adam Wybray. And don't forget, if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little dedicated segment in an episode just like this, where you can plug your own podcast or blog or website or business or whatever you like, then simply sign up to our Patreon at the $20 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. So you mentioned that this film, so it begins with like, you know, this I guess our kind of heroine, although she's sort of an anti-heroine, right? Dr. Susan McAllister.
Oh, yeah, we can talk about that, can't we?
Yeah, Saffron Burrows, who she's sort of trying to find this like drug, this cure for Alzheimer's, this treatment, right? That she wants to then ultimately test on these sharks, which is obviously really bad to do and goes against the, what do they call it? The Harvard Convention or something like that. So it's all very unethical. Do you think this movie does care about any of that stuff? Like, is it a comment on Big Pharma, like, I guess, and that kind of thing?
No. The reason I don't is I think the only reason that it's there is because they want to at least some way ground the movie in a semblance of reality. And so if there's like a level of science there, whether it makes full sense or not, for most people that are watching, you can kind of go, oh, Alzheimer's, right, okay, oh, yes, science, oh, okay, brain fluid, sure. Like, we kind of, we buy it, and I think that's literally all they're doing, because if a movie is so ridiculous, you just end up getting Sharknado. And so you have to walk the line, I think, and ground it in at least enough reality that the audience can go, cool, great, now I can enjoy the sharks, you know?
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's like, it's a nice, like you said, it's an easy shorthand. Like, we get that, okay, it's going to try and reverse the effects of Alzheimer's, therefore it's going to increase, I don't know, brain capacity or intelligence or whatever. And I think that's pretty good. And I like that she, again, like, you might assume when we first are introduced to this main female character that she's going to be our sort of hero. And she's really not, actually, is she? You know, and she meets, again, quite a mean end by the end of it as well, which I loved.
She does, which is a bit of a bummer. Am I right in thinking that ending was changed?
Yes, absolutely.
I do remember thinking, even as a kid watching it, that I still didn't want her to die, because even though what she's doing the wrong thing, but for the right reasons, and it's still the wrong thing, but she has worked so hard, and she's also fought, you know, at least within the context of this moment, you know, she's fought to get to the surface, and she does, and then ends up sort of sacrificing herself ultimately, which is kind of sad, and kind of mean.
It's totally mean. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The film's ending was changed shortly before its theatrical release. Originally, her character would escape the shark-infested waters and live, and there's like a photo of a deleted scene where she snogs, what's his name? You know, the main guy.
Thomas Jane.
Thomas Jane. And you're right. Audiences were angered by the ending because she was responsible for the shark experiments, and they reshot it. And then in 2019, a fan petition was created calling on Warner Brothers to release the original ending where she survives.
Right.
So, yeah, that's so interesting. That is such a classic thing, isn't it? It's like famous Fatal Attraction story as well, where it's like, make the woman suffer more at the end, basically, you know?
Right? Isn't it? And, you know, we don't have to get into that, but like, it's just very, very telling, isn't it? What at least that whoever these test audience people were, what they wanted to see, shall we say?
Absolutely. Did you like hunky Thomas Jane in this movie, Josh?
Oh my God, yes. You know what's so funny? I know that I'm older now, because at the time I was like, oh, he just looks like
an old guy.
He was too old. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah, like just like a man, and I was into like, I don't know,
Joshua Jackson or somebody.
Exactly, the 20-somethings that were playing teenagers.
Yes.
Like that's what 13-year-old me was into.
Of course.
But now, well, Thomas Jane, hello.
Yeah. He's great. I love all of the supporting characters are really fun, actually, as well. I love Michael Rappaport, you know, like, and he always plays that kind of like angry New Yorker, right? Like slightly wisecracking guy. I think he's really fun in this.
Yeah, I'd forgotten what had happened with his character as well. I thought we were going to do a Jurassic Park and have him betray them for some reason, and then he doesn't. And actually, he's a very well-meaning, quite kind character.
Yeah.
And when he gets scared and he just wants to stay with Thomas Jane, it's like really sweet as well. So I think they pull off the characters as best they can, for sure.
I agree. And Stellan Skarsgård, who again, I guess, first death, quite a nasty death, as you've already said, right? Gets his arm bitten off, gets strapped to a gurney, dragged underwater, and then used by the shark to break the glass, right? He gets smashed into the glass. Love that sequence. But again, he is almost also treated as like a villain along with Saffron Burrows' character, right? He's like the mad doctor who wants to play God, essentially, you know?
Yeah. And it's somewhat smart storytelling, I think, which is by having him killed off, that's sort of like the surprise where you think, oh, is he going to maybe have more time in the movie? And that's the surprise kill. So then when Samuel L. Jackson ultimately gets it, that comes as a genuine shock.
We're going to pull together and we're going to find a way to get out of here. First, we're going to seal off this movie.
It's so good. And like, I think that's when you really know as well that the film is in on the joke, right? Because I think it does, again, it's a really clever balance because it does take the horror seriously. Like we've said, it's quite mean and nasty. That Stellan Skarsgård sequence is quite brutal. But the moment that Samuel L. Jackson gets killed, this like iconic jump scene, right? Where he survived some sort of ordeal in the Alps or something, right? Like you said, like he was trapped in an avalanche or something. Like that's part of his backstory.
Yeah. He has the line where he's like, "You think water moves fast? You should see ice." Yeah. It's so intense.
So good.
It's so intense. And the fact that like he says something like, 7 of us survived the avalanche, but only 5 of us made it out. And he's nothing more dangerous. You know, if you think nature's dangerous, mankind is going to be even worse. And he's basically inspiring Thomas Jane to kind of take the reins and be the leader. I remember actually watching this with my parents at one point, and my dad being like, yes, and this is the moment where he inspires Thomas Jane's character to be the lead. We didn't think he was going to be the main character, but now he is. Like, and I think it's done in that way where like we can all kind of, because my parents aren't really film lovers or film viewers really, but like it's bold enough and obvious enough that you can go, now I know what's going to happen. Okay, fabulous. Like, it's just funny.
Absolutely. And actually, it's amazing, really, that it was even such a shocking jump scare, because I think now I watch it and the way it's filmed, where you get like a big wide shot and you see him stood right on the edge of the pool, you're like, okay, I know where this is going. And I think it's also really fun nod/wink towards like Quint's monologue in Jaws, right? It almost feels like it's referencing that, like that incredibly moving, emotional, powerful monologue that Quint has that we all talk about and love. It's kind of a joke version of that almost, isn't it? I think
it is. It's almost like is it Phoebe Cates in Gremlins? Almost like that little speech, isn't it, really?
Yes.
It's kind of doing that and then immediately undercuts it. Which I think the film does quite a lot and I think does quite well. It's, like I said before, it's really gleeful in the way that it dispatches its characters. I remember when, and this is the actress whose name I don't know, but the woman, the assistant with like the classic like blonde bob, choppy bob.
Yeah,
we'll just call her Choppy Bob.
Choppy Bob.
I remember being a kid, and we're also immature, but thinking, oh my god, the way the shark's biting between her legs, oh my god, like it was like scandalous on the playground when we were like 12 or whatever.
Totally. No, it's so true. I guess that's the other thing about this movie and the 90s, is that they were also quite squeaky clean, and there's not a whole lot of like sex or sexiness by this half of the 90s, at least, actually, right?
You're right.
And like you say, kind of some odd kind of like maybe pro-Christian stuff too in this movie.
Yes. And also there's the one moment where they're looking in Choppy Bob's room after she's been killed, and they're looking for batteries, and one of the characters says, oh, where does she keep her, like, where, you know, don't women have things that run on batteries? And this is clearly I've not watched this film since I was old enough to understand what a vibrator was.
Sure, yeah.
And so it's not sexy, but they do have those, like, sort of awkward moments, like the moment where it's just purely for the trailer where she gets a kit off to kind of ground herself so she doesn't get electrocuted when killing the shark. And it's like they slip in those moments, but really they are being pretty chaste by comparison to what we were getting in the 80s, and then what we later get in the 2000s with something like Piranha, where it's just like, oh my god, Tits McGee, you know?
Yeah, you're right. And I think this is part of the reason why this movie made so much money. There's clearly this kind of formula, I think, with American audiences particularly, but probably British at the time as well. Like, I was writing recently about Friday the 13th, and that thing of Friday the 13th has, which is where it kind of has its cake and eats it, right? It will show you a bit of sex, it will show you some boobs, but actually it's got a quite kind of almost conservative values about it too. It's very much like,
yes,
you know, sin and you'll be punished. If you're good, then you'll survive, right? Like, and it kind of plays well to, you know, let's say middle America as well as kind of, you know, genre fans. And I think this movie sort of has a bit of that too, doesn't it? I think, you know, ultimately it's quite mean to the characters maybe that have it coming, and it might hint at a bit of like broy sexiness, and like you say, that amazing sequence where she strips off her, because what is it, Saffron Burrows' character has to like take off her rubber wetsuit so that she doesn't get electrocuted, right, when she then like puts a live wire into the water to electrocute the sharks. And we do get this like absolutely hilariously explicit gratuitous shot of just like the camera just drifting down her body as she strips off, essentially. And again, like, very of its time. I remember Jennifer Love Hewitt getting into the sunbed in I Still Know What You Did Last Summer as well. Very similar.
Yes. Oh my god, that's almost shot exactly the same, isn't it? I can see that in my mind now. Yeah. And honestly, you know, fair enough. Like,
sure,
you've got to sell a movie, and, you know, these actresses are, you know, to a degree sort of having to sort of sell themselves a little bit as well, and that can, you know, give them more capital in Hollywood or whatever at the time. So, and I'm sure there were lots of teen boys that really enjoyed that as well. So. Absolutely.
It ticks all the boxes.
It does, doesn't it? It does. It's just all part of the feel of those movies. But you're right about the sort of the conservative values of the movie, and I think it's just showing how binary everything is. Like, there's right and there's wrong, and if you do what we see as wrong, then you know you're going to get punished. Because I think with these types of movies, maybe people don't want the grey area, they don't want that sort of complicated way of looking at stuff. And
absolutely, I think you get that especially in these animal attack movies. Like, you know, with home invasion movies, I think it's messier. I think human beings are all quite nasty and can have a propensity for violence, and that's part of what makes home invasion quite uncomfortable. Whereas with animal movies, it's usually like, there's the good ones and there's the ones that really have it coming, right? Like that's usually how you feel about most animal attack movies, I think.
Well, the plots of every single animal attack movie is just fuck around and find out, isn't it? That's literally what the plot is for all of them. And there are those people that love nature and love animals that, you know, ultimately triumph in the end. Even though they end up having to maybe kill the monster or whatever. And then there's the ones that kind of, no, we've got to keep it alive. We want to test on it. We want to do this, that end up getting, you know.
Because, yeah, you're right. Like, LL Cool J's character, he is Christian. He has a pet. He loves his animals, right? Although that poor parrot, the parrot, I thought that was quite brutal, that you see the parrot get eaten.
I mean, that parrot was a fucking arsehole, though.
Oh, it was really rude parrot.
Really rude.
But yeah, like, he does get chomped and caught by the shark, but survives, right, as well. And again, it's all very telling, that stuff.
Yeah.
There you go. Anything else you want to mention? Any other highlight sequences that we haven't mentioned? What's your favorite kind of horror set piece of this movie, would you say?
I mean, we can talk a little bit about LL in the oven. I loved that. I thought, good. I mean, it's so ridiculous. The science in this movie, like, I remember thinking, so setting the scene, you know, he's He's gone into the kitchen. There's a shark that these allegedly like 25 feet sharks or whatever that somehow can fit in like waist deep water, and you know the logistics just never quite match up in my brain. But he's escaped the shark by getting into his own oven, and he's got the little wisecrack of like, oh, I can't, you know, I'm not going to die. I'm not going to be the chef that gets killed and cooked alive in his own oven, because the shark has turned it on.
So good.
The shark's accidentally turned the oven on, and so he's got this little axe and he's hammering. He's cutting through the roof to get out the top so he doesn't choke on all the gas. And I just remember loving that, and then blows the fucking shark up with a lighter that would be so wet and wouldn't light.
So, I know, it's so true. Again, the science in this movie.
It's so dumb.
It's but there's something really visually satisfying about that, isn't there? It's like how people always joke about the science of, in movies, whenever a car crashes into another car, there's a giant explosion, and it's like never in a million years would that happen. But it's really satisfying to watch every time it happens, isn't it? You know?
Oh my god! You know what made me laugh? Actually, poor Brenda up in the tower. So you've got this character of Brenda that does nothing but sit up in this tower not the whole movie, for about the first 30 minutes, and then when the helicopter crash, which sort of instigates the whole shark's escape, she just gets like blown back in this room.
So
I was like, oh my god, they didn't care about Brenda, did they? Poor woman.
Poor Brenda. I know. And then, of course, at the end, you know, we find out that really all the sharks wanted was to be free, right? Was to get out of that compound and to get to the deep blue sea. And they mention the title.
Yeah.
And of course, like, there is a throwaway line that LL Cool J says as well, where he's like, so there were only 3 sharks, right? And he's like, yeah. Franchise set up, Josh, is that, do you think?
Maybe. I mean, there are sequels.
There are sequels, yeah.
I've seen.
Oh, have you seen them? What are they like? They were like
Yes.
direct-to-video sequels, right? Deep Blue Sea 2 in 2018. So a big old gap.
Direct, yes.
And then Deep Blue Sea 3 in 2020. Wow.
Absolutely. Right. So I have seen them. They are... Now, I'm just stalling for time as I search through my Letterboxd, because I did review them. I can't remember, actually, if I saw Deep Blue Sea 2 or 3 or both. I've not seen 2. Have I seen 3? What did I say? I gave it 2.5 stars, and I said, a bit long, with bad CGI and too many action set pieces that feel like a big finale, but the cast are likeable and diverse, and the few shock surprises work well. Dumb fun.
Oh, well, there you go. Lovely. Yeah, I mean, I have not seen them. How interesting that it took like 20 years to get these 2 sequels that we then got back to back, right?
I know, right?
Yeah, very strange. Maybe that was in the wake of like the Meg and stuff. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah,
it's like,
maybe.
sharks are back, you know?
I think movies started changing around this time, didn't they? You know, the difference between movies that were coming out in 1999, 2000 were very different to what we were then getting in 2003, 4, 5, you know?
Totally. Yeah.
They just weren't quite as big.
I mean, it's mental how big this film was. Deep Blue Sea performed well. It opened on July 30th, 1999 to 3,000 theatres, grossed 18 million in its first weekend. By its second week, it was still 5th place in the top 10 behind The Sixth Sense, The Blair Witch Project, The Thomas Crown Affair, and The Runaway Bride. What a time.
Oh my goodness, that just took me back.
I know. The film's performance was compared to The Mummy and Jan de Bont's The Haunting, which that same year had similar budgets and made a significant impact on the box office in the summer of 1999. Oh, what a time.
I mean, The Mummy is excellent. The Haunting is dreadful, but I watched both of those movies on repeat constantly as a kid.
Yeah.
So yeah, this was just the time, wasn't it? Like, these are, and it's interesting, you know, maybe they played a big part for a lot of young horror fans as well. You know, these sort of gateway blockbuster horror movies. And you're ticking all your boxes there with sort of, you know, you've got your Hammer horror, you've got your haunted house, and then you've got like an animal movie. So
good. Some better than
great
others,
legwork
like
for all of us.
Some better than others, like you say, you know. But yeah, I think this movie, it holds up pretty well too, right? Like, it's 25 years old. How did you find watching it this week? Like, did any of it feel a bit like cringy or dated to you, or is it still a fun time?
It's funny. It's tricky when you've seen a movie so much, and I'll probably be able to have a more clear answer when we talk about our next film. But with this one, I had a lot of fun watching it. And a lot of it just brought back a lot of memories, really, rather than me sort of seeing any differences. The only thing that jumped out to me was the vibrator joke, which I hadn't picked up upon until literally this rewatch. And all the Christian stuff. Like, I think watching a movie through sort of one, adult, and two, modern eyes does have a difference, but so much of it just felt like good old nostalgic fun for me.
Oh, completely agree. I think it's impossible not to have a fun time watching this movie. Like,
it's so silly.
It's so silly, but it knows it's silly. Like, I think it totally gets what film it is, I think, right? And I think that's what makes it work so well. That's where Rennie Harlin's less successful movies fall down, I think, because like with The Strangers, we're kind of like, is this supposed to be naff and laughable, or is it trying to be something really dark and serious? You
can't quite tell, can you?
Yeah, exactly.
Whisper in the classroom.
That was a little clip you just heard there from Candyman 2, Farewell to the Flesh from 1995, and that is what we were discussing over on Patreon this week. We continued our Legends of Horror mini-series, something that we've been doing kind of gradually and intermittently for the last couple of years for $10 patrons. This is where we cover titans of the horror genre, whether they're actors, writers, directors, producers. We've covered Wes Craven, Stephen King, Roger Corman, Jamie Lee Curtis, James Wan, a whole bunch of sort of important people in the genre, and it felt like the perfect opportunity this week to discuss and pay tribute to the late, great Tony Todd, who died, of course, last week. So I was joined by a brand new guest, Devon Taylor, who is going to be on the main feed here on our Nature Bites back season next week, funnily enough. But he joined me on Patreon to discuss Tony Todd, the life and career of the incredible actor and horror icon. We talked about what made him such a presence in horror and why his portrayal of Candyman is one of the most iconic performances in horror history. And then we finished with a little in-depth discussion of that sort of slightly forgotten Candyman sequel that people don't really talk about very often. So it was really nice to go back and revisit it. Candyman Farewell to the Flesh from 1995. So that episode is available to all $10 patrons and higher. So if you want to check that out, as well as the rest of our exclusive mini-seasons and other weekly bonus episodes, sign up to our Patreon. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. $5 per month will get you a huge back catalogue of old episodes, and you'll get fresh blood every single month, but $10 will get you a new episode every single week. But everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little shout out on the main feed as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of August a little thank you. So a big thank you to The Beard Off My Back, Matthias C, Horrorverse, Craig Thomas Force, Vorte Janssen, Akilla Toad, Bryn D, Colin Snyder, Francesca, Mike Ali, Hayden Popel, Sam, Nigel Perrotte, Cedric Renelo, Sarah, Brian Robinson, Jose Fernando Carrero Martin, and Stephanie Sprague. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon in the month of August. And one more time, if you want to join them, get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Josh Tonks and I discuss killer crocodile movie Lake Placid from 1999.
We heard a man was bit in half.
Any recent bear attacks?
Bears don't attack people underwater.
Probably a fever then.
What was that?
Whatever's out there being shot with this is dead.
Oh no. Sheriff, how many deputies you got? You came here to help you find it. We can't let him kill it.
Experience a few parts mystery.
Do you have any theories of why he's here?
Honestly, I don't know.
And a few parts missing.
It's a human toe.
Is this the man who was killed? He seemed taller.
Oh my God.
Lake Placid, directed by Steve Miner. This came out also in July of 1999, the same month as Deep Blue Sea. Now, Josh, this is, am I right in saying the first time you had seen Lake Placid?
It is, yeah. So, yeah, completely the opposite. No sort of nostalgic feelings about this one. It's also one of those movies that features a cast where I'm like, yeah, I've just missed everything you've done your entire career. Like, I had to look up and go, who were all these actors? Like, I was like, oh yeah, Brendan Gleeson. Yeah, I know that name. What have you know, and it might sound like sacrilege to some of the listeners, and I apologize, but it's just funny how sometimes movies, an entire person's career can pass you by because the movies they do just, you either miss them or they just didn't quite hit your taste or what you liked. And they can be a big star and you're like, I'm like, Bridget Fonda? Huh?
Well,
Bridget
Fonda, one of those classic examples of somebody that was big in the early 90s, like so many actresses, almost that kind of Sharon Stone, Demi Moore, Jean Triplehorn kind of era, and then like so many of those actresses kind of disappeared, I think, off the grid. But yeah, but so much fun. I want to talk about that, but first of all, let's get into the plot, what there is of the plot. Josh, tell us about Lake Placid.
Let's do it. Okay, so after the gnarly death of a diver in Black Lake, disgruntled and recently dumped paleontologist Kelly Scott is sent to investigate. Teaming up with Fish and Wildlife Service Officer Jack, wealthy crocodile obsessive and professional cad Hank, and the local sheriff Harold. One of them's Hank, one of them's Harold. Sorry, whatever. Kelly discovers that a pissy attitude won't help when faced with a 32-foot saltwater crocodile with a taste for man meat. Throw in some cringy 90s dialogue, dangling cows, and a Betty White cameo, and you've got Lake Placid.
Yes. Oh my God, I love it. So I'm dying to know, Josh, like first time watching it, what did you think of Lake Placid?
You know what? I had a lot of fun with it. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad that I watched it. So I watched Lake Placid first and then I watched Deep Blue Sea. Just in case I didn't like Lake Placid, I wanted to end on a high with something that I did like. Lake Placid is, by comparison, so small. It's almost gentle. It's like just perfect Sunday afternoon viewing for all the family, but with like a little bit of bite.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I had a load of fun.
Completely agree with you. You're right. Like if Deep Blue Sea felt more like big bombastic disaster movie monsters, this felt more like almost like Tremors, those kind of like small town, small cast movies with quirky characters, and like you say, a little bit of bite, but almost like it's accessible for the whole family in a weird way. This movie, yeah, But I actually did have way more fun with this movie than I almost anticipated. I was sort of expecting it to maybe be a bit dated, full of bad CGI, maybe ropey dialogue, and I think this movie, I again laughed and I had a smile on my face through most of its very brief 80-minute runtime as well. It's
so
just
short.
Really fun and breezy.
Classic Steve Miner, obviously. So we had the Halloween H2O reference with Deep Blue Sea. We've also got it here because Steve Miner directed H2O the year before, which is also a very short, brisk 80-minute movie. I was looking at the runtime of this as the credits were rolling, and we hadn't even hit 1 hour 20. I was like, okay, fab.
Yeah.
And I think that is, if I was to make a bit of a complaint, I think the finale of this movie it sort of sneaks up on you a little bit. I was like, absolutely. This is the end. Okay, cool. Fine.
The climax is so anticlimactic.
Yes.
Like, it is really like, it's almost like they just run out of money and it just ends. Like, it's very strange. I agree with you. Again, in comparison to that explosive ending of Deep Blue Sea, this is so low key. And I do wonder if that is also just, there's a really interesting difference between Rennie Harlan and Steve Miner as directors, I think, right? Steve Miner, I've complained about this quite a lot, about H2O. There's so much good stuff about it, and the teen drama and the dialogue and the character work, but it's such a slight movie in terms of its horror, I think. And it's kind of the same with this as well. But obviously he made Friday the 13th Part 2, which is like a fan favourite, and he made Part 3, and he did House and Warlock and a couple of other movies. But he was also famous for directing episodes of Dawson's Creek, Smallville, and The Wonder Years as well. So he's clearly got that thing where he likes the kind of the human heart of these sorts of like films. And I think sometimes almost he prioritises that over the horror, you know?
I think so. And I think because there isn't as much of that in this film, the heart, or at least the character, shall we say, sort of makes up for it. I was cackling the first third of this movie because this character of Kelly, this paleontologist, she's just so rude to everybody. She hates, like, you know, Maine. She's from the city, you know, like, she's so shitty to everyone. And she's just been through a horrible breakup, you know, being dumped. And, you know, the guy, she was dating her boss, who's now dating her best friend. And she's kind of gone away to this podunk town in Maine to investigate this killing. So random, but she's so pissy. And then you've got the sheriff, who is obsessed with people being sarcastic and kind of does that joke to death in like the first 10 minutes. I had so much fun with these characters. They really make it work until, you know, the crocodile shows up, for sure.
I agree. And again, a name I haven't mentioned, we talked about Steve Miner, but this movie was written by David E. Kelly, which again, like, not somebody you associate with horror or monster movies. This is the guy that created and wrote Ally McBeal, as well as a whole bunch of other kind of legal shows, Boston Legal, Boston Public.
Yes.
He also wrote Big Little Lies, the TV show. So he's this like massively successful TV show runner and writer, right? And so really interesting that he made this killer crocodile movie. But I think, again, that sort of makes sense when you think about, again, like we just mentioned, like the sassy dialogue, the funny characters, and how the film sort of cares about that more than the monster horror, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you bring up television, because it does feel like these are a cast in an ensemble show. You know?
Yeah.
I almost feel like they could do Lake Placid, the TV series, and, you know, stretch this out over 8 episodes and have the mystery of the crocodile or whatever. But maybe that could just be like one episode, and then there's different things that happen at Lake Placid, you know, each week, and different mysteries to be solved or something.
Like an Erie, Indiana or something. Yeah, I think there is a bit of that. I was thinking that too. Maybe it's because of the main connection, but I was thinking of Stephen King, and then I was thinking of Mike Flanagan, and I was like, you could almost have a Mike Flanagan-esque TV version of this, I think. You know? I
would die. I would love to see that. I wonder what, like, you know, because what Mike Flanagan does is famously take the source material and then go off on his own journey with it. I wonder what you would do. I mean, to be honest, there isn't much source material when we're talking about Lake Placid, but like, imagine his version. That would be so fun.
That would be amazing. There'd be a lot more monologues.
Yeah, Kate Segal would be the crocodile.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, let's have it. So you met, like, I've seen a lot of people complain about the main character of Kelly Scott, played by Bridget Fonda. I think she was absolutely hilarious in this. And like, I like that she wasn't a particularly likable main female character. Like, I don't think that was a problem. I think that was really interesting about her, that all of these men that she's stuck with are sick of her. I love the fact that she keeps getting severed heads like lobbed at her as well. I think that she's hating every minute of it. Why is she even on this expedition as a paleontologist? Like, I don't really understand that. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just, you know, we clearly weren't ready for it in 1999 because the reaction to both Saffron Burrows' character and Kelly in this movie, like, you know, clearly we couldn't handle flawed women. They either had to be Linda Hamilton or some, you know, some ingenue that needs saving. There was no in between. I like it. I'd be the same. I'd be like, fucking moose head thrown at me. No thanks. Oh, I'm in the lake again. I've been like flipped out of a boat. I'd be so annoyed. I fucking dust bones. I don't deal with this shit. You know what I mean? Like,
I know.
I'd be livid. So yeah, I'd be really shitty. When she's like, I have to sleep in a tent. I thought we were going to be in some like cute hotel. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. completely agree.
I thought exactly the same. I was like, God, I would maybe be less blunt about it than she
Yes.
is, but I'd be thinking the exact same thing. I'd be like, oh, it's fine, I'll sleep in a tent then. But inside, I'd be reacting exactly like she is.
Furious.
In those
Furious.
moments. Yeah. Furious.
This is me who works. This is me who works at a summer camp every year, and I'm like, I hate the outdoors.
Yeah.
Hate animals. Hate the outdoors.
I was going to say, actually, you spend so much of your year at camp, you must be pretty used to the elements.
Yes, very true.
Spiders and creepy crawlies and that kind of thing.
But again, I work in the theatre department, darling. So I'm in fucking side all day. But I'll get to the end of camp and they're like, "Where's your tan?" And I'm like, "I didn't go outside."
That's amazing.
I was hanging costumes for 2 months.
And I think, if anything, I think she's the most interesting character in this film because I think the men are all a bit interchangeable. You even mentioned in your synopsis, you've got Hank and Hector and Jack.
Oh, Hector. I called him Harold.
Jack, first of all, played by Bill Pullman, who I guess we could kind of compare almost to the Thomas Jane character, I guess, in Deep Blue Sea, the kind of like the crocodile hunter guy in this. But I don't know. I don't know if he's quite as interesting. I mean, I think Bill Pullman
he's a bit boring.
He's a bit of a boring character, isn't he? I think Bill Pullman himself makes it work because I think he's quite a charismatic leading man. And again, somebody I so associate with the 90s. And he's very handsome, he's very nice, and he's very, like, I don't know, he's got all that kind of leading man thing about him. But the character, there's not much to him, really, is there?
No, not really. He's probably the most boring out of all of the men. But he sort of has to be. He sort of has to be that grounded figure. We have to be able to set up that sort of, simmering romance between, the only viable male and female characters in the movie, And he's very charming and, warm and sort of... They have that friction, but it's never mean in the way that the other characters are to each other. And it's that sort of like, I hate that guy, but now I'm going to fall in love with him vibe that you get in rom-coms. And I think it plays out quite well, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a lot of sass being thrown about from all characters in this movie, right? None of them really like each other, but there's this kind of like they learn to work together. I guess in some ways, that there's a parallel to Jaws, it feels like, right? You've almost got Jack, Hank, and Hector almost feel a bit like Brody, Hooper, and Quint, right? You've got like the kind of the straight man who's just kind of the all-round good guy. You've got the kind of slightly more neurotic one, and then you've got the weirdo, right, as well. And I think
Oliver Platt just fucking chewing the scenery.
What a weird character, right? Hector, played by Oliver Platt, who like worships crocodiles.
It's so weird. But I actually really came to love Hector and Hank's relationship and how they sort of end up a little bit like besties at the end.
Yes.
But they're just constantly annoyed by each other all the time. I found that quite engaging. And actually, it's funny. Normally, the sheriff character, it's almost we've been programmed now to really dislike all police characters in these types of films. They're either like the Wes Craven bumbling cop trope, or we're doing something a little bit more modern and political with it, in which, we don't want to like those characters. And what was sort of great about, and refreshing almost, even though this is a film from 1999, about Brendan Gleeson's character is that he's like totally grumpy, curmudgeonly the whole way through, but he was kind of my favorite character.
Yeah.
He was the one I liked the most because he just wasn't as ridiculous as... He was just like, oh, fucking hell, like a crocodile. Oh, here we go,
Oh my God. And it's so perfect for Brendan Gleeson. So did you say you're not that familiar with Brendan Gleeson and his other work?
No, I know the name, and I'm sure I will have seen plenty of things that he's done.
He's an Irish actor, and he absolutely nails that kind of nice, warm, but kind of grizzled and sick of your bullshit type roles, right? Like he does a lot of that. He was in a lot of those kind of like really interesting Irish movies made by people like Martin McDonagh. He was in the Banshees of Inisherin, and he was in Calvary in Bruges, famously. He was also Mad-Eye Moody in the Harry Potter films.
Oh,
he was
right. Yes, I'm looking now, and it's like I'm looking at these movies and go, yeah, I've seen Braveheart, and I like 28 Days Later, and Gangs of New York, and Troy, and Cold Mountain, and Paddington 2. But if you know me, do any of those sound like a Josh movie to you?
No, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely not.
So I've seen them, and he was supporting roles in them, and I'm like, great, you were fabulous, love you. But when we're talking about what I'm going to be obsessing over, those aren't the movies.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Father of Domhnall Gleeson. Do you know Domhnall Gleeson, Josh? You might be more familiar with him. Yeah. He's great, and I agree with you. I think he carries that quality that I love about him and everything he does into this movie, which is that like he's kind of grumpy, he's kind of sick of everyone. But we kind of love him. Yeah, exactly. Relatable, exactly, yeah. And then Betty White. What a weird moment when Betty White...
So random.
As the kind of, again, quite a trope in kind of 90s comedy. I think of things like Something About Mary and various others, but the kind of the foul-mouthed old lady, right, as well, which is always quite a funny thing, who's secretly been feeding the crocodiles cows and her husband, right, as well.
And doesn't give a shit about any of that. She's like, yeah, and I'm going to carry on doing it, so leave me the hell alone. It is really funny. Betty White is obviously just an icon, and I wasn't aware of Golden Girls at the time, but knowing how much of a national treasure she is, especially in America,
I think that's it. More in America than here,
for
I think,
sure.
Probably. Yeah.
To have her crop up in a movie like this, it's like, well, she's the queer element, you know what I mean?
Right.
For us, because the rest of this is like sort of quite macho of a movie, but at least we've got Betty White in there for sure.
That's so true. And again, there's this kind of 90s element that has that, like, let's bring in a cameo from a veteran, like, that we'll all recognise. It's like bringing Janet Leigh into Steve Miner's Halloween H2O or whatever,
Exactly.
Now comes the part of the episode where I'm going to thank our next 30 Kickstarter backers for helping to create Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. Final Cut is now in stock, and you can pick up your copy from our website, evolutionofhorror.com/shop. It's a perfect little Christmas gift for a friend or family member, and we do ship to any country in the world. So if you want to grab your copy, just head on over to our website. So I'm going to thank the following 30 people for supporting our Kickstarter campaign. A big thank you to Emily Heckman, Alex Torsten Stelling, Fox Knezovich, Barnaby Darling, Nick Mason, Carl J. Olsen, Patrick Hanna, Peter Christmas, Rastislav Yabokovic, Laura Turbinismo, Alfred Joyner, Kimberly Lowe, Joe Gillis, Michael Kristen, Lauren Colzar, Isaac Jones, Sam Clements, Alice Bailey, Stephanie Ross, Chris Downey, Brian Suave, Mark Venzel, Robert Hurst, Amelia, Ivor Gortz, Gary and Finley Boyd. A huge thank you to all of those people for supporting our Kickstarter. And one more time, if you want to pick up your copy of the official Evolution of Horror card game while stocks last, then head to our online store, evolutionofhorror.com/shop. Well, it's probably telling, isn't it, that we've been talking about this film for about 20-25 minutes and we haven't mentioned crocodiles yet. But let's talk about the crocodile itself, who we don't see fully until about 40 minutes in, when it chomps down on a bear. How do you feel about this was one of those like silly questions I asked that's a bit like, do you like trains? But how do you feel about crocodiles in movies? Like, do they scare you as much as sharks do, Josh?
Maybe not as much, but they still do. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm so out of my element in water. I don't have very good eyesight. I wear contact lenses and can barely see.
Do you? I didn't know that about you.
Oh yeah. I've got terrible eyesight. I think, you know what it is with animals? I'm a thinker and I'm a talker. And I'm not a particularly primal person, I guess. And you can't talk an animal down,
No.
really.
No.
They ain't going to listen.
No.
They're just going to eat you. And so I can't do anything. And I'm not going to be swimming away. And I won't even be able to see anything under the water. So I think that particular element of animal attack movies I find the scariest. And so, yeah, there were moments in this film that made me jump, and I didn't like at all. I was like, this is horrible.
I think I find generally the concept of crocodiles and alligators scarier than sharks, because I don't like that they can come up on land as well as in
land
water.
as well. Yes.
They do that thing, right, where they grab you and apparently they
Twist
flip you and drown you and stuff. Like, no, not...
You're supposed to roll with them, apparently. You're supposed to, like, roll with the roll.
And is it supposed to... And is it supposed to be that you're supposed to climb a tree if you come face to face with one on land, because they can't climb trees? But again, I can't fucking climb trees.
I
Josh,
can barely climb a tree. Oh my God, I'd be dead. You know what, as well? I think there's something about the way that these types of movies are shot. And I've been thinking about this recently because obviously you're a massive Twin Peaks fan, and what David Lynch does so well is... Oftentimes it happens in Mulholland Drive, it happens in Twin Peaks. You're in the perspective, you're in the POV of a character, and you're looking around a corner or a door or something. And what I think the best of these sort of animal movies does is it puts you in the perspective of someone swimming under the water, and there's going to be something that's going to come out of the murk at you. You know, these monstrous teeth that are going to be coming right at you.
Yes.
And how do you get away? And I think that's what that anticipation is what I find scariest about these films. And it's interesting how many of these films don't know that and don't do that. And so the moment I've seen the creature and it's not been presented to me in a way that I find scary, I'm like, oh cool, I'm not scared anymore. But that building anticipation of like, it's going to happen, and then if they nail it, it's terrifying. If they don't, it's like, okay, cool, and now I can carry on with the rest of the movie, and I'm not really scared anymore.
Totally. And I think there's something about them, the stillness of crocodiles, actually, that I find scarier than sharks too. Like when you go see them, you know, at a zoo or at a safari or something, they look so still, and they're probably really unhappy and bored, but they're just sitting there so still. Yeah. But I think they play on that in this movie too. I mean, this movie is way more, in a way, a comedy than a horror and than Deep Blue Sea was. But there are a couple of quite powerful moments, like when Oliver Platt's character comes face to face with that crocodile, and it's just looking at him for ages. And, you know, he's all like, oh, I'm going to go in there because I've got this connection with crocodiles and I'll be fine. And then he realizes at the same time that we do, like, oh no, he's fucked, basically. Like when he comes face to face with it.
Terrible mistake.
And it's I think that's a really well done little set piece, that moment. And then he kind of has to he has to distract it. But that just feeling of it just staring, like about to pounce at any moment is really creepy. And then scrabbling onto the helicopter and then it grabbing the helicopter and everything, like, it's good shit. I like that. And I agree with you completely, Josh, that like compared to a human nemesis who you think in your head you might be able to reason with, there's absolutely no reasoning with creatures like that. Yeah.
No, it's either hungry or it's not.
Yeah.
You know? And I don't know what's scarier, actually, being on the surface of the water. Oh my God, there's so many elements, actually. I don't know what's scarier, and there's going to be multiple ones now. Being on the surface of the water and not being able to see underneath. Yeah. Not being able to look down, like in this lake, you can't see it.
Yeah.
So when the crocodile just disappears under the water, you're like, oh my God, where is it? Or you're on the surface of the water, you can see it, and you can see it coming for you, and that's horrible.
Oh my God.
Or you're under the water as well, and it's all murky, and at any minute something could pop out. It's like being in outer space. It's horrible.
Yes.
The one bit that got me was where there is that shot of where the crocodile just comes right at the camera and it hits like the wooden tree or the beam or whatever that's what a guy's like hiding behind. That bit got me for sure.
Oh my God. They're really brutal creatures. I went on this like safari thing in New Orleans earlier this year, and we did some alligator spotting, and there was a moment, and I filmed it. I'll post it when this episode goes out. It's really gruesome though. There was a moment when we saw this weird white thing floating across the water, and I was like, what is that? And as we got closer, the tour guide was like, oh, that's another alligator that because they're cannibals too. They eat each other, alligators. Yeah. And I know this is a crocodile in this film, but I think they're similar in that regard. Like, they can eat each other if they get hungry enough. And we saw this alligator that was dead, flipped on its back, that was being dragged along by another massive one beneath the water. And we couldn't see the one beneath the water. We could just see the dead upside down one being dragged along by something bigger. And that in itself was just like, I was like, get me off this boat.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Isn't nature delightful?
Oh my God. It's absolutely terrifying, isn't it? So what do you think of the way the effects, I suppose, like the crocodile itself? There was Stan Winston, right, I believe, that did the effects on this movie. Like, do you think they pull off the visuals well?
I was pleasantly surprised. I think it's pretty good. I think that there was obviously some CGI, again, but even that isn't too bad, and there isn't too much of it from what I can remember. But I thought the actual sort of animal design, and I think it's great. It was definitely giving Jurassic Park as well.
Yeah.
Especially the stuff towards the end with the helicopter where it's it's stuck in the helicopter or whatever.
Yes. Yes.
But I thought it was great and scary and
really good.
They don't do much in these films about humanizing the animals.
No.
They are kind of sort of these like soulless monsters almost. So I found it interesting at the end of this one that they sort of got into at the 11th hour, they're getting into the debate as to whether or not they're going to
kill it or
take it. And then obviously, spoilers, we have the twist that there's a second one.
Yes.
And I thought, we're going to get this is like that extended surprise ending where, we've got the one trapped and then the other one's going to come on land and we're going to have a big sort of chase. And no, they just blow it up.
Yeah. That is really weird, that stuff. So like the build up to the ending where we've got the cow. You've mentioned this when we talk about Deep Blue Sea.
Can we talk about the cow?
The poor fucking cow, right? So there is an image of a cow being dangled by a helicopter as bait, right? And it's really funny, but also kind of devastating at the same time that you're watching this cow panic and wiggle its legs about in the water, not wanting to be there, right? And it's quite a horrible thing to look at.
And this is the moment where I was like, okay, maybe I don't miss the excess of these types of movies. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I would rather a stupid CGI cow be dangled, or maybe just a rewrite where we didn't have to have that moment, because we are in a wide shot and we've got our two main characters having a conversation in the foreground, and in the background there is a helicopter dangling a real cow over a lake, which might seem impressive. I mean, it is, but it's also like, do we need this? Why are we doing this? I was like laughing, but also horrified. And then I thought, okay, that's just going to be it. But it's not. Then we get to the night shoot where the cow is still being dangled. It's like, how... Either they used multiple cows or that one cow went through it. Like, I don't care what they say about, like, no animals were harmed. It's like, that fucking cow is pissed off.
I'm hoping / assuming that maybe it wasn't a real cow in all of those shots. Like, I think definitely when you see it initially dangling, that looked like a real cow. But I can't imagine when you see the cow at night, like, panicking and kicking its feet. I was like, surely that's probably not a real cow. Maybe that's animatronic, or that's some visual effect, or maybe it was, I don't know what. But like, I hope that wasn't a real cow that was distressed being dangled in the lake.
It was so ridiculous. It was so ridiculous. I messaged you being like, what is going on?
What is happening? Yeah. And again, very Jurassic Park, that, isn't there? There's the moment when they feed the cow to the raptors. Yeah, they dangle it down.
The goat.
So, yeah. And it's kind of absurd and funny, but creepy. But yeah, that whole sequence, and then they catch the alligator, and there's that moment when it's caught on the shore, and they're sort of talking about what to do with it. And then you're right, this big twist that there's another one. That felt like a bit of a wasted opportunity, right? That a second one comes out, immediately grabs, I think, Hector, right? Grabs Oliver Platt's character of Hector. You think that's it. That's the big Samuel L. Jackson surprise jump scare death. But it isn't.
Yeah.
They immediately kill that second crocodile, and Oliver Platt's character survives it. And you're like, oh, that felt like a bit of a wasted opportunity. Again, there are those moments that make the film feel a little bit toothless compared to Deep Blue Sea.
It is. It doesn't kill any of its characters.
No.
It almost introduces like a deputy that can get beheaded, which is a fun sort of sort of moment, I guess. But you know, we've got these characters that we care about, and you're waiting for the moment where the film kicks into gear and starts actually, you know, killing them. And it doesn't. So it does feel very just warm, soft, low stakes. There's like no stakes in this movie at all.
No, there really aren't, actually, are there? Because then there's not even like this giant showdown with the main crocodile. It gets captured, it gets tied to the back of a truck, and it gets taken away. And you're almost waiting for like the final sting where something's going to happen.
Yeah.
Where it breaks out of its confines wherever it ends up and sets up a sequel. I don't know. But it doesn't really do that, does it?
No, just got Betty White feeding the babies.
Yes. I suppose that's the sting in a way, that like, oh, there are loads of others. Loads of baby ones. But yeah, it's a strange movie, but I didn't dislike it. Like I have a really fun time watching this movie. Like it's a perfectly fun,
perfectly fine.
Minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see why this would be, you know, kids of the 90s that watched this and it was maybe their first time watching a movie like this. They'd have such fond memories and this would be one of their favorites.
Yes.
And it does really show you the power of nostalgia, because I had so many memories regarding, like, specific random memories regarding Deep Blue Sea, and obviously nothing for this. And I had a fun time, but I'm probably not going to revisit this one as like, oh yeah, let's throw that on for the comfort.
Yeah.
I you know, because I didn't watch it when I was 10.
I sort of wish, and maybe also this movie does feel lower budget than Deep Blue Sea. Like, I think there's not as much money on screen, is there? And I sort of wish that they had made a bit more with the lake and the woods too, right? It's pretty generic lake and woods, really. Like, there's nothing. And again, considering Steve Miner directed 2 Friday the 13th movies set on a lake in the woods, I don't know, like, I felt like there maybe could have been more of that. Like, you don't get that sense of place in the same way that you do the Aquatica or whatever it's called in Deep Blue Sea, you know?
Well, yeah, it absolutely comes down to the storytelling, which is, well, you know, you don't want to get eaten by this crocodile, well, just leave it alone and don't go on that lake. Yeah. What do you need to go on this lake for? This private lake that only really seems to be one house around it anyway.
Right.
So
yeah,
what's the big deal? I think whereas with the Aquatica set, it's like, well, they are under the water and there's been a huge storm and that place is coming down and the sharks in the water and there's the sort of the sciencey, you know, the stakes of the Alzheimer's research and all of that. There really isn't any of that in this movie. So it's kind of like, well, you could all just kind of go back 100 meters and be fine.
That is true.
Don't go in the little boat on the lake.
That is it, and that's exactly it. Like you said, it's a lot lower stakes for some reason, isn't it? I think, but it didn't need to be. I think like making a movie,
could have made it.
Like, you know, in some ways that could have been done as a higher stake thing than the sharks in the middle of the Deep Blue Sea. You know, like, so yeah, it's interesting the tone that it took with it.
You could have had a load of houses that were surrounding that lake, and like pets were getting killed, and like maybe like, you know, small children were in danger and things like that.
Exactly.
And make it a little bit more like Jaws, where, you know, you do have these innocent families at risk, and, you know, this elderly woman sort of at the, you know, the root of it, I guess. There's things they could have done, but it feels very small, and that the budget is smaller, and they do very well with that, though, because it does pretty much feel like a one location movie.
It does,
and it
definitely
does. It does well with what it has, and the animatronic crocodile looks fantastic, and the script
amazing.
Just makes it a load of fun. So
yeah, exactly. There's so much to like about it. But you're right, like, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about how the 90s felt like such a different time in terms of the scale of their movies. But actually, this movie, probably, apart from its cast, maybe, it could feel like a Netflix 2024 movie in a way, in that it's quite small, it's quite contained, it's a single location, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree.
But it did spawn a bunch of sequels. There are 6 Lake Placid movies. I'm guessing you've not seen any of them.
None of them. No, I don't think I knew that there were sequels, actually.
So this is great. There's Lake Placid 2, 2007, Lake Placid 3 in 2010, Lake Placid The Final Chapter, 2012, which,
hilarious,
spoiler alert, wasn't the final chapter. Classic.
Never are.
In 2015, we got Lake Placid versus Anaconda.
Fun.
A mashup.
Okay.
Also, I love that it's not the crocodile versus the anaconda; it's Lake Placid versus anaconda as well. Like,
Well, that's actually what they don't tell you is that's the crocodile's name.
yeah,
Miss Lake Placid.
Miss Lake Placid.
Welcome to the stage, Lake Placid.
Yeah,
It's like a drag queen.
so good. And then Lake Placid: Legacy, which was the most recent one. Such generic sequel names, aren't
Yeah.
they? Legacy, the final chapter, like so good.
Lake Placid, Origin, Lake Placid.
Yeah, always. There's always an origin. There's always judgment or something.
Oh,
as well,
yes,
all
yeah.
of that kind of thing. But overall, I think it's pretty fun. The critics were pretty mean to it. Roger Ebert gave it 1 star out of 4.
Of course he did.
And said it was completely. What did he say here? He said completely wrong-headed from beginning to end, and put it on his list of the 10 worst films of the year. The general consensus on Rotten Tomatoes: Betty White's delightful supporting turn may be worth the price of admission, but Lake Placid is swamped by a smarmy script and an inability to deliver on creature feature mayhem as well. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of get the criticisms towards it, but I think people are being a bit harsh about it.
It is smarmy, but I kind of didn't mind that. I thought that was quite fun.
Yeah. There you go. Well, there you go. So, like, having watched them both this week, I've got a feeling I know the answer, but which do you prefer, Josh? Which is your fave of the two?
Lake Blue Placid. No. It's Deep Blue Sea. Deep Blue Sea is the fave.
Yeah.
But I think if I'd have watched Lake Placid as a kid, it might be a closer call for sure.
I don't know if it's because I have that slight nostalgic. I don't think I even talked about this, but I watched this on video as well, the exact same time as Deep Blue Sea. In fact, I might have even weirdly double billed them, like on the same weekend, like 2 rentals at the same time. But I really love this movie. Like, I think it's really fun. I had a smile on my face all the way through it, and because it's so short and breezy, I think I actually kind of. I think I had a bit more of a fun time with it even than Deep Blue Sea this week, weirdly. But I think they're both.
It is an easier watch, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think it is. Well, there you go. Well, Josh, thank you. My final question for you, of course, is what's your favourite film from this whole subgenre?
I think if we're putting Jaws to one side,
Okay,
let's put that to one side because that's just in its own league, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
Probably. Arachnophobia.
Oh, yeah.
I love that one. I think that's so fun and scary. Are we including Jurassic Park? Are they animals?
I mean, you could, yeah. I'm
Because that, obviously,
Yeah.
but we'll put that to one side as well because it's a big old Spielberg movie. But yeah, probably Arachnophobia. And then I have to shout out Tremors, which I watched for the first time this year.
Yeah.
And had so much fun and loved that. I thought that was great.
so good.
Yeah, so probably those.
Tremors is another one of those films. I covered that with Arachnophobia a couple of weeks ago, and we were saying the same thing. Like, who couldn't like Tremors? Like, it's such a likable movie in every regard. I think those kind of small, fun characters and the way it's done on such a low budget. Yeah, like, it's funny. We talk about the 90s a lot for horror and as being like a bit of a low point maybe for the genre, or being known for those kind of glossy teen movies. But the 90s was quite a time for creature features too, and I think sometimes that goes underappreciated. You know?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, and The Birds, obviously, is great.
My God. Perfection. Yeah, perfection.
A classic.
Amazing. Well, Josh, thank you. Such a pleasure, as always, to have you here. Let people know where they can find your work and where they can find more Josh Tonks online.
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd because fuck Twitter, man.
Yeah.
That ship has sailed. In fact, it has sunk. So you can find me on all of those. It's just my name at Joshua Tonks. And then you can check out my movies, The Latent Image and Lord of Wolves. Have a look on. Just give them a Google. See where you can find them. I think Latent Image is on Deku. And Lord of Wolves is currently only streaming in the US, but you can rent it there, and it will eventually get it'll drop here at some point, but I don't know when. But keep an eye out for that if you want some werewolf B-movie goodness.
Perfect. Amazing. Josh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my wonderful friend and brilliant guest, Joshua Tonks. I loved discussing those two movies with Josh. Please do get in touch. Let me know what you thought of them, Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find me on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, although Twitter, less so these days, Instagram, and Blue Sky as well. I'm on Blue Sky. Find me there, Mike Muncer. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord or the Evolution of Horror discussion group. That's on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on your podcast app of choice, as that always helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and we are staying in the 90s. I just can't keep away from them. Next week I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest, Devaughn Taylor, and we're going to be talking about two natural disaster movies, one from the 90s and one from the 2000s. We're going to be talking about Jan de Bont's Twister from 1996 and Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow from 2004. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.